Act 1. The Victorian Woman. Womanhood in 19th century England was rather traditional. Women were in charge of the home, the children, and domestic life as a whole. There was a focus on the separate spheres of men and women with sharply defined roles. This ideology rested on the natural characteristics that made men predisposed to work labor jobs and women to work in the domestic realm. The primary model for the Victorian woman was Queen Victoria herself, who, according to the BBC, represented a form of femininity which was centered on the family, motherhood, and respectability. Her marriage to Albert was the image of marital stability and that set the precedent for women across England. Because the connection between men and women was still traditional, women remained second-class citizens who were thought to be not very troubled with any sexual feeling. As the turn of the century inched closer, though, there was a new movement popularized, the New Woman. Act 2. The New Woman. In her 1894 essay, The New Aspect of the Woman Question, author Sarah Grant addresses the autonomy women desired from their male counterparts. In this essay, she identifies the new woman, or a woman who wanted radical change from the male-dominated society of their time. The new woman was seen as someone who wanted an education, female emancipation, and women's suffrage. Sexuality was another prominent aspect of the New Woman movement, with an emphasis on the double standard of purity. Women were expected to be chaste, whereas there was a prominent culture of men having sexual relationships with female sex workers, which was evident by the boom of syphilis. There was also less of a focus on tradition. Marriage and children became less of an importance for the women involved in the movement. At the time, they were the focus of satirical cartoons, such as this George D'Amour sketch from Punch magazine that depicts the comparison of new women to men at the time. While Miss Goldenberg, an unmarried new woman, is standing in a traditionally masculine way with her ankles showing, the vicar's wife is covered head to toe in a modest Victorian manner. The vicar's wife is addressing Miss Goldenberg as she would a man coming home from a hunting trip. Within the Victorian society, the idea of the new woman was both reveled and highly scrutinized. In a letter to Theodore Martin, Queen Victoria addressed the New Woman movement with unease. The Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights, with all of its attendant horrors on which her poor, feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feeling and propriety. In literature, female writers were embracing the idea of the new woman by including independent heroines such as Edivane Frayline of Sarah Grant's The Heavenly Twins and Mary Arley of Ella Hepworth Dixon's The Story of a New Woman. Male writers, on the other hand, had a split idea of the new woman and often criticized its ideals in their novels. The new woman was often typecast as either overly sexual or overly intellectual, both undesirable to the male creators and male audiences absorbing this media. In Dracula, Bram Stoker warps the stereotype to address the strengths and weaknesses of the new woman through his characterization of Mina Murray and Lucy Westenra. Act 3. Dracula. Lucy Westenra and Mina Murray were the two primary women shown in the novel, and while they are best friends, they are completely different. Mina is a school mistress who is fiercely loyal to her husband and has a man's brain, meaning she is logical and rational. Lucy, on the other hand, is described almost solely through her physicality. She does not have a job, and because she is beautiful, she has 3 suitors asking for her hand in marriage, although she eventually does choose one to marry. She says to Mina, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her?" This is played off as a joke, but it most likely reflects her genuine sexual attraction to all 3 men. Together, the 2 women form an image of the new woman. Lucy, the sexual libertine, and Mina, the independent working woman. Stoker's opinion on the ideology of the new woman becomes apparent by the end of the novel. Lucy is a sexual, murderous vampire, only characterized by her voluptuous wantonness. And Mina is a brave and gallant mother, whose son already knows of her sweetness and loving care as he is born. As Lucy continues further down into the rabbit hole of vampirism, she becomes more sexualized, and there is little fight against her demonic self. Mina, on the other hand, breaks down and feels unclean because of the mark Dracula shows on her forehead, and she fights any form of vampirism that Dracula attempts to put onto her. The image of these women can be read as Stoker's opinion of the new woman. There are positives to the movement, such as Mina's hypnosis being the sole reason Dracula is caught and eventually killed, and negatives, like Lucy's sexual prowess that leads to her husband driving a stake through her heart. There is a clear message of punishment for the sexually promiscuous beyond Lucy, such as the other female vampires being nothing more than beautiful child murderers. Mina is gifted with life at the end of the novel because of her loyalty to Jonathan. And while she represents the traditional Victorian housewife by remaining pure, staying loyal to Jonathan and his insanity, and finally having a healthy child, Mina is a more modern version of this ideal. Stoker is showing how the woman of the Victorian era can continue into the 20th century without being outdated. Conclusion. Art is representative of its time period's ideology. The political undertones of Dracula help support this idea. The view of women in the novel was a progressive one for its time period because of Mina's contribution to her male-dominated team, but it still warns women against sexual promiscuity. The New Woman was a movement that continued well into the 20th century and continued to be written about, but Bram Stoker's view of womanhood is a textbook definition of how the average British man saw this movement of the time. It is incredibly important to view art as a capsule for when and where it was created, and while some only see Dracula as a venture into the supernatural, it broadcasted the many fears of the British male, one of which was the independent woman.